welcome to all of you. It's a delight to see some of you on screen and more of your names down on the participants list. I'm Mike Higton. I work at Durham University and I'm hosting the webinar today. And it's will be a delight in a moment to properly welcome our speakers for this evening's webinar. But just before I do that, I want to say a couple of words about what this is all about. It's one in a series of webinars that we started about a year ago on power in the Church of England. It's organised jointly by the Michael Ramsey Centre for Anglican Studies here at Durham University, and also by the Department for Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. And the purpose of the webinars is to explore the many forms of power that shape the life of the Church of England, to look at the ways in which these forms of power shape people's experience in and around the church, to look at some of the accounts of power, theological, sociological, for instance, that circulate in and around the church, to ask what it means for power to be exercised in healthy ways, and to ask questions about the nature and impact of the misuse and abuse of power. So quite a wide-ranging agenda that we've set for ourselves. And this is the fourth webinar in that series. You'll be able to find online the videos from the earlier webinars, and we've got others which I'll tell you about right at the end, coming up soon. A few practicalities before I do the proper introductions. We'll be having presentations from our two speakers, and then after a short break, we'll have an opportunity for question and answer from the audience. And at that point, one of the ways of doing that will be to use the chat function on Zoom. Can I ask you not to use it while our speakers are talking initially, just because it can be really distracting for them and for others if the chat's going on during the talks, but feel free to use it afterwards. And I'll say a bit more about how we're arranging the Q&A when we get there. Can I also ask you, obviously, to keep yourself muted as you're all doing at the moment, but also can I ask you to turn your video feeds off, because for some people on low bandwidth, it actually helps if there are fewer video feeds coming through. If you ask a question later on, do feel free to turn your video back on and obviously unmute yourself, but we'll come back to that later on. The other thing to say is we are recording this webinar. You'll see the little recording symbol there on screen for most of you. And we'll be making the video public in a while, once we've had a chance to edit it and add titles and things. We won't include a video of the Q&A. It will just be of the initial presentations. So you don't need to worry when you ask your questions later on that you're being preserved for all posterity to see. The video will just be the initial presentations. I think that's all the practicalities. So let me do the more interesting part and introduce our two speakers. I'll introduce them both now and then hand over to our first speaker. So we have, first of all, Karen Gorham, who is Bishop of Sherborne in Salisbury Diocese, and obviously in that position has direct experience of navigating the hierarchy of the Church of England and some of the forms of power involved in that. And she's been involved in things like running the Leading Women course at Sarum College, which has helped women in the Church of England explore what it means to enter senior leadership. So a great deal of expertise to bring to our topic today. And we've also got Lis Goddard, who's the Vicar of St James the Less in Pimlico, and she's been involved in a number of initiatives aimed at nurturing women's ministry in the church. So things like the Junior Network, the Church of England's Transformation Workstream, and others, and was also published in this area. So again, someone else with a great deal of experience and wisdom to bring to this topic. I should have said that our topic today is women and power in the Church of England. So it's that topic that our two speakers are going to be guiding us into. I'm really grateful to have you with us today and looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. So without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker, to Karen Gorham.
Thanks, Mike. I'm just going to share my screen. It's good to be with you this evening, and just to put you, put myself into some kind of geographical context, I'm zooming in this evening from North Dorset, just south of Shaftesbury, if you know that part of the world. I've been Bishop of Sherborne in the Salisbury Diocese since February 2016, and prior to that, I was Archdeacon of Buckingham in the Oxford Diocese for almost 9 years. Well, I wonder what comes to your mind when you read the title for this evening's presentation, Women and Power in the Church of England. My offering this evening is my own thoughts as I just ponder this topic. Much has been written in recent years on women and power. One of the most popular, maybe because it is a fairly slim volume, is this book written by the best-known classicist Mary Beard. In the book, she visits the gender agenda and shows how history has treated powerful women. She starts this book with the story of the first recorded example of a man telling a woman to shut up, at the start of Homer's Odyssey, written almost 3,000 years ago. Telemachus tells his mother Penelope, "Mother, go back to your quarters and take up your own work, the loom and the distaff, for mine is the power in this household." Well, over 2,700 years later, Florence Nightingale wrote this of the Church of England: "I would have given her my head, my hand, my heart. She would not have them. She did not know what to do with them. She told me to go back and do crochet in my mother's drawing room, or if I were tired of that, to marry and look well at the head of my husband's table. You may go to the Sunday school if you like it," she said. Well, as we hear this in sympathy for Florence and Penelope, we see that here are two women who simply want to be the person they've been created to be. So what is power? Well, there are several definitions here if we look at the word power. And in reading the top 5, the ability to control people and events, strength, an official or legal right to do something, authority or to act in a forceful way, I would say that most of us women would want to disassociate ourselves from those meanings. Women and these definitions of power maybe do not sit comfortably with us. However, if we begin to see power as the bottom 4 things, being taken seriously, the use of our abilities to provide something with the energy it needs, or the ability to make a difference, then perhaps we begin to warm somewhat and to see the link between what we call vocation, a God-given calling towards something, being a catalyst which enables power to be exercised. And as we consider women and power in the Church of England, we can then see how our desire to be taken seriously, or to give energy to something, or to make a difference by using our abilities, has been inhibited. I don't have time to go into much detail with this, and some of these things don't need much explaining. However, I do think there have been 5 main inhibitors to women exercising power. Firstly, patriarchal structures, which continue to affect key institutions as they have been shaped and occupied by men for so long. And this in turn has created a lack of opportunity. Men are inevitably the gatekeepers and have been relied upon figuratively and literally to open doors for women. This, combined with theological interpretation, which Liz might cover later, and societal norms, have led to defined roles for men and women within the church, which, unless there is structural change or new vision, has led to the repression of women and the denial of gifts given equal worth. It's easy to collude, and it takes a brave woman to step away from the norm and independently seek change or betterment. History, though, is full of such women, but you have to search to find many of them. So sometimes we ourselves can be the problem, as we perhaps deny our own God-given gifts and abilities, conforming even when we sense that we're being called to something different. Such programmes in the church as Leading Women, which Mike's already mentioned, have in recent years been aimed at encouraging those within the church to take risks and to be brave in taking a lead in exercising the power within. Before I move on, I want to say something which has also been true, that women can have problems with the image of being called to servant leadership. Sometimes we tell ourselves that we are following Christ, and in doing so end up as a doormat for others, or far worse. The church too has colluded with this, as the Church of England and many other churches have seen women as the ones who do the flowers or the cleaning or serve the tea, rather than being the upfront leader. And women have been content with that. Instead, Christ, in calling them and us friends, after washing the disciples' feet, gives us worth in our service, for which we can hold our heads up high, thus bringing power to our acts of service. We need to remember tonight that the Church of England is still coming to terms with the contribution that women are making as they assume positions of power and leadership, and that women are still working out what this means for the way that we are and the way that we do church, and for the building up of God's kingdom here on earth. Historically, church wardens have exercised office for probably some 700 years. And by the mid-14th century, they were elected by and from parishioners as representing the laity. Not all of them were male. So locally, some women found themselves in positions of power. However, it wasn't until there were significant changes in church structures that the voice of women could really be heard and taken seriously. In 1916, Maud Royden wrote this about the Church of England: deacons, choristers, church wardens, acolytes, servers, and thuriffers even the takers up of collection are almost exclusively men. If at any time not one male person could be found to collect, the priest does it himself. In one church, the impossibility of getting any male youth to ring the Sanctus bell induced a lady to offer her services. After anxious thought, the priest accepted her offer, quote, because the rope hung down behind a curtain, so no one could see her. Change came in 1919 in something called the Church of England's Assembly (Power Act, which began to create more egalitarian structures. It's interesting that the word power is used here. The acknowledgement that lay men and women should also have a say in the way the church was governed led to the formation of the General Assembly, which led in the 1970s, only in the 1970s, to the formation of the General Synod. Up to then, powerful patrons and male bishops and priests, together with Parliament, wielded considerable, if not almost all, power. The lay voice was key as power was unlocked and distributed inside and outside the church. Those working on the fringes with the all-important matters of education, serving the poor, providing for the sick and the housebound, could begin to set agendas, could begin to have a say in the formulation of policy, could change legislation. Building on the important work of deaconesses, the voice grew louder for holy orders being open to both men and women, based not only on justice or the rights of women, but by new understandings of the Bible and theological interpretation. It's less than 30 years ago that women were ordained as priests, with the first female archdeacon being licensed in 1996. For women and power, this was important because church legislation gave archdeacons significant power over their own archdeaconry, with the responsibilities that went with it. They had power to gather people, to visit parishes, to exercise discipline together with the bishop across the wide area. Then in more recent memory, 2015 saw the first consecration of women as bishops after the legislation had been passed in synod a year earlier. That's the context we meet in today, and hopefully we can tease out later how things have or perhaps haven't changed in such a relatively short time. Now, in the second part of my input, I just want to look at what I feel is healthy power into which women have and can step to make a real difference and provide the energy that God's church needs today. Firstly, the power of circumstance. Here we have two artistic depictions of the story of Esther. It's interesting that in one, she is depicted as a sexual being, probably seen as a woman wielding her powers of provocation and flirtation to get what she wants. In the other, she is seen in partnership with Mordecai, seeking God's direction together. Esther is an example from the Bible of a woman in the right place at the right time. The power of circumstance means taking the opportunity of the place in which we find ourselves to make a difference. Another biblical example was Phoebe, of which Paul writes in the book of Romans, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. It's clear that Phoebe used what she had to support the early church, her benefaction making other ministry possible. Catherine Booth, the wife of William and the founder of the Salvation Army, did the same, using his opportunity for leading services. She started preaching, and very soon William found Catherine was a much better preacher than he was. There are some great quotes from Catherine, which I'm sure we could all pin to our walls as a reminder to step out and use our God-given abilities. You are not here in the world for yourself. You have been sent here for others. The world is waiting for you. If we are to better the future, we must disturb the present. And about women, she writes, she is equally called, equally appointed, equally serving. Another woman depicted here is Dr. Christina Baxter, who was appointed principal of St John's College, Nottingham, a Church of England training college, in 1997. Christina was one of the first members of the Archbishop's Council and a leading lay member of the General Synod. She used her position to speak up for theological education and the training of men and women. Secondly, the power of invitation. In that powerful encounter in St John's Gospel, where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well, she replied to Christ's request and was invited to taste the real living water. The encounter prompted her to leave her jar behind and to go and tell others about Jesus. At her words and her evangelism, others came to Christ. Many years later, the Bishop of Rochester invited Isabella Gilmore to encourage women in parish work, and this was the start of women as deaconesses. There are some lovely stories told by Isabella in her autobiography about the ability of women to lead others to the church through their social action and outreach in a way that men couldn't. Women have followed on this pattern, calling others into relationship with God through their preaching, through their writing, through their service, such as Paula Goodder, a lay reader and canon chancellor at St Paul's Cathedral. The power of invitation. And thirdly, the power of commission. The Great Commission urges us to go. However, this command came from Christ first to Mary, who was commissioned by him to tell the good news of his resurrection, specifically to the other men. Power and authority are given through the commission of the church. And as women have been ordained as priests and consecrated as bishops, so the authority which the church has is equally distributed. Priests are called to exercise power by leading, by having oversight. They're called to teach and to admonish. They are to discern and to preside. Bishops are called to be merciful, but with firmness, to minister discipline with compassion. There is a lesson here in power dynamics. This isn't power for the sake of power, but God's upside down kingdom, where leadership is gentle as well as firm, where authority is loving, where grace is everything. Finally, power today, I believe, is all of these things: circumstance, invitation, commission, but also about using our gifts in collaboration. We can make a difference by stepping out alone. However, we can make all the more of a difference doing things together. The Bible clearly states that we all have different gifts, that all are needed as we plan, support, and trust one another. We may pick up later on about how momentum for change can be gained, or we can further energize together. We may want to consider how power works through movements for change, such as the Me Too movement of recent years. In the bottom of this picture, you can see some of our final cohort of the last cohort of leading women. However, in my input, I just want to end with the next slide, the final slide, because in all that I have said, ultimately, the power is not ours, but God's. And our calling is to receive and use wisely and well the indwelling power of the Holy Spirit, wherever God is calling us to be and to go. This is not subservience, but true servanthood. Thank you.
Karen, thank you for that. Thank you so much. I'm sure that others like me have questions and responses, but hold on to them for now, because we're going to move straight on to our second speaker, and to Lis Goddard. So Lis, over to you.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. So thank you so much for having me today. And just to give you some context, I am, as Mike said, a vicar in central London. At the end of September, we had the privilege of welcoming a new SSM, that's a self-supporting curate. That's Rooney, who you can see in your picture with Bishop Sarah. Rooney comes from a global majority heritage background, and she came to our multicultural estate church in the centre of London. She's in her early 60s, works full-time, and trained on a new part-time scheme which allows those at the end of their working life to train for ordination in a year, whilst at the same time going through the discernment process. She was ordained with one other woman and a man, both of whom had trained on the same scheme. They're all very capable. The other two are returning to their sending churches. Rooney is not, because her sending church comes under the Bishop of Maidstone and therefore cannot receive her back. As we begin reflecting on women and power in the church, perhaps that's as good a place as any to start. In other words, the fact that there are women worshipping churches across our land where it is taught that, for theological reasons, they should not be in leadership, that they should not be ordained. The reasons for this are varied according to the wing of the church you engage with. It can be to do with representation, that the priest represents Christ at the altar, and that, as Christ was a man, a woman simply cannot do this. I would suggest that the issue with this theology is that in becoming the man Jesus, the eternal Son was taking on all of our humanity, not excluding half of the human race. And indeed, in dying on the cross for us, his sacrifice was once for all. Linked with the representative argument can be a deep understanding of the Holy Catholic Church, and therefore a concern to preserve that Catholicity. which means that until the whole worldwide church embraces the ordination of women, it is not possible for a single church to do so. Women's orders cannot be valid because they cannot be recognized by the breadth of the Church Catholic. The issue here is that no Anglican orders are reconciled by, for example, the Roman Catholic Church. So this is rather a moot point. When we get to the other end of the church, the one from which Rooney comes, they take a different view on this whole debate, whilst coming to the same conclusion. Theirs is based on a theology of headship, which suggests that the New Testament writers understood overall that leadership should be male in all spheres of life. In fact, most have now narrowed this down to just the church and family. And how strictly this is applied varies. So some will allow women to teach men, whereas others will not even allow women to take on roles such as a sidesperson, which takes us back to what Karen was talking about, right back at the beginning of the 19th century. In fact, most have narrowed it down to that. So it is based on effectively 4 key texts in the New Testament and a particular reading of Genesis 1-3, which is read into those verses. I'm afraid I don't have time to unpack all of this here, but it's important to say that how we read Genesis is key to this. In other words, whether we read it in a hierarchical, patriarchal way, which establishes a creation order, or see in it the mutuality of relationships which God intended for us, echoing the mutuality of the Trinitarian relationship, and which, if it works out in the leadership within the church, would in fact be transformative. So if you just give you 2 ways in on this. As you read Genesis, it's useful to note that in Genesis 1:26-28, when God creates humanity, male and female, in his image, he gives them both authority, both dominion over creation. There is a rich mutuality between them, expressed later in the language of helper, a word generally used of God in the Old Testament. At no point prior to the fall does God speak of the man ruling over the woman. And indeed, it is not until after the fall that the man thinks to treat the woman like one of the animals over whom he has dominion by naming her Eve. There's much more that could be said around this, but that may be for discussion afterwards. How we read Genesis has a vital impact upon how we read what comes later in the Bible. Suffice it to say that this inevitably has an impact upon the power dynamics within the church. Power dynamics which mean that some women feel that they cannot continue within their own context once ordained, or indeed cannot take on roles of leadership at all. Though in fairness, it should be said that the Bishop of Maidstone, the current Bishop of Maidstone, has set up a network for women's workers, but also interestingly, and it wouldn't be fair to speak about this subject and not say this, there are also power dynamics currently at play, which mean that men from these wings of the church, especially the conservative evangelical, don't now get preferment. They too face a glass ceiling. Another interesting thing that we might wish to talk about. But let me take you back to Rooney, our new curate, and her 2 counterparts. Quite apart from the interesting fact that, unlike them, she cannot return to her sending church, the contexts in which they will serve are very different. Whilst Rooney joins a team with only 1 person in full-time ministry, both the other 2 join large, flourishing teams with young male curates. The reason behind this are complex and reflect a whole range of power dynamics, including those of class, privilege, poverty, race, but also, importantly, gender. And it is this latter structural issue that I want to explore with you today. Many people, if asked, would tell you that the numbers of women and men being ordained today are pretty equitable. And whilst it is true that the numbers of ordained women has risen, it is still the case that only 30% of all stipendiary clergy, that is those who get a stipend who are paid, only 30% of all stipendiary clergy are women. And the highest number in any diocese of all female clergy, stipendiary and SSM, that's self-supporting ministers, is 45% in any diocese. Put alongside that, the reality that a far higher proportion of all female clergy are SSM, self-supporting, compared to their male counterparts. So, for example, the Diocese of Sheffield has nearly as many self-supporting female clergy as stipendiary female clergy, but 5 times as many male stipendiary clergy as male self-supporting. Winchester and Canterbury show a similar pattern. But why does this matter? Why is it important? Surely what matters to the church is that men and women are getting ordained, that women are being ordained. Well, yes, on one level, that is true. It is wonderful that Rooney, our new curate, has been ordained, a woman from Sri Lanka who brings with her a wealth of lived experience. But as we look at those who the church is ordaining, we need to do so with an understanding of power dynamics. Ordination is not neutral. Not all priests are the same. Now, of course, in terms of church order, that's not true. A priest is a priest, is a priest, is a priest. And yet structurally, it doesn't work like that. I was recently part of a group where some correspondence was referred to us. It was from a young woman in training, selected for oversight ministry. In other words, to be a stipendiary priest. It was from a young woman in training, and she had been told by her bishop that because she was part of a clergy couple and her husband was ordained, and therefore in receipt of a stipend, she would need to be SSM, self-supporting. In other words, supported by her husband's stipend, no matter what she did. There was to be no discussion about this. It was just a fait accompli. I should say that this is not the only example of this sort of blanket decision-making that I and others have come across. And I have only ever heard of women being given this sort of fait accompli. Men are never told that because their wife is a doctor, that they cannot have a stipend. Of course, clergy couples may be told that there is only one stipend available if they want to job share. But I have only ever heard of a woman being told that if she wants to work, even separately from her husband, she may not have a stipend. Indeed, may not be appointed to certain roles. And that does happen. Now, there are those who would say that this is fair enough. A stipend is designed not as a wage, but to set you free to do the work to which God has called you. However, it is important, as we think about this, to note what goes along as a corollary of this. If you are not in receipt of a stipend, you are not in receipt of a pension. So if you do house for duty, as a woman who should be earning a wage, you do not get a pension. Which means that should you be the one whose partner dies, though you have quite possibly worked just as hard as your spouse, you will live only on a widow's pension. Interestingly, not only are you not in receipt of a pension, but you are also barred from paying into the additional voluntary contribution scheme, even if you have been on the pension scheme previously. We are told by those who manage it that this is because it is impossible to manage. And yet other professions manage this perfectly easily. And there is evidence of this. If you're not in receipt of a stipend, you are often not in receipt of CME money for training. That's not always the case, but it is in some places. And in many dioceses, you don't get regular MDRs, that's Ministerial Development Reviews. SSMs, self-supporting ministers or spouse-supported ministers, as I sometimes like to call it, are often treated as a different species. That's not always the case, but often. If you're not in receipt of a stipend, if you are SSM, the truth is that your ROM, that's your Register of Ministers, which is what the church calls your CV, is read differently. You may have been barred from certain roles, not through choice, but necessity. Or you may have done roles as demanding as your stipendiary brethren, but there is still an endemic problem within the Church of England about how ROMs, CVs, are read. It wasn't long ago that I was involved in hosting a consultation of patronage boards around the appointments to large churches, defined as those who have a usual Sunday attendance of over 350. Of course, there are very large churches that are up there at 800 to 1,000 or more. At that point, only 3 of these churches had a female incumbent. The number's higher than that now, it's nearer 6. One of the issues we consistently came up against was the problem that, as one person put it, and I quote, in order to lead a large church, you needed to be an alpha male and you needed to be able to work long hours. It was perceived that a woman with parental duties would not be able to do this. Quite apart from what this says about the expectations we place on clergy and the issues of well-being this raises, plus what it says about how we view parenting, there are a raft of other questions raised here. It is hard for women who have had time off for parental leave or who have worked flexibly, as many do in the early years of child's life, or who've been SSM, often not necessarily because they've chosen it, but because they've been forced into it, to demonstrate that they can meet those requirements. Though anyone who knows what it is like to hold down a job and juggle a young child will know that there is no question of being able to work long hours. In 2 of the large churches in London, which are currently led by women, those women are part of a clergy couple, where the husband started off as the lead. Now, don't please misunderstand me. They are both excellent leaders. But there is an interesting question around perception and power of whether they would have been appointed had it initially just been them up for the job. It is interesting to note that despite recommendations to DAG, the Development and Appointments Group for senior roles, and to key patronage boards, that in the Church of England, we still don't have a policy of reading ROMs blind against the key criteria which have been developed for any role. That policy is standard practice in other professions. And yet the church still hasn't adopted it. And when we look at senior appointments, particularly episcopal appointments, diocesan bishops are still the key gatekeepers. And diocesan bishops are still predominantly male and white. Many of you who've been around the church for a while will know there has been an issue around the selection and training of younger female ordinands. This is an image from the very first Young Female Vocations event, which we did. It's of a young woman who didn't want us to show her face in case her incumbent saw her. And yet, this is what she wanted to be heard. So specifically, the problem we faced, and still face to an extent, continues to be, with young vocations is the imbalance between young men and young women under 30. Back in 2012, the ratio of young men to women was 7:2. Through a series of initiatives, like the specific vocations events which we have run, this has changed and has begun to level up, though there has never been equity. It had reached 2:1. But, as you'll see from these figures, there has been a shift with the number of young men dropping. However, it is still the case that 58% of women ordinands were aged between 40 and 59, while 53% of male ordinands were under 40. Why does this matter and why does it happen? Both come down, at least in part, to power or perceptions of power. It matters because our senior leadership is more likely to be drawn from those who entered the priesthood earlier, not necessarily just in their 20s, but certainly before their 40s, whose ROM shows a breadth of experience. With the introduction of the senior leadership development program, this is even more the case. Interesting to note that of the last 8 suffragan and area bishops to be appointed, 5 of the last 8 have been in their 40s. When that is noted, it is hardly surprising that our senior leadership is still predominantly male. You'll see from this table that though the numbers of female archdeacons, deans and suffragans are slowly creeping up, the numbers of female diocesans has remained static. Of course, the argument would go that one wouldn't expect that there would be in any way an equal number of appointments to these roles, given that there aren't equal numbers coming through. A circular argument. But whilst that may be true, the current situation is of a real imbalance of power. It is generally agreed that for good decision making to take place, where the concerns of a minority, and I use that term advisedly, as women are not in fact a minority in the church, the fact that it feels as though we are a minority is to do with the use and misuse of power. Where the concerns of a minority are to be taken into account, you need at least 1/3 of your members to be from that group. Clearly, this is not yet the case with diocesan bishops, or indeed with the House of Bishops. The House of Bishops being diocesan bishops plus elected suffragans to the General Synod. The House of Bishops, in the House of Bishops, women make up just 20% of that group. When we look at the recruitment of ordinands and their respective ages, we are not just thinking about the long-term effects on senior appointments. We know, of course, that Anglican ministry is notoriously flat. It's not a career, but a vocation. We know that. And we must never get to thinking that's what it is. However, when someone enters training, matters for a whole raft of reasons, not just in terms of the balance of those available for senior appointments. It matters because it affects the gender balance of those available for stipendiary posts. More men are stipendiary than women, which means that more men are leading teams with women as assistants. Alongside this, there is the significant issue of training. And I know that when I talk about this, I'm talking about things where angels fear to tread. This has been a vexed issue for a long time, and one which some in the church don't like to discuss. but frankly, it matters. It has long been the case that women, especially older women, have been encouraged to train part-time. This has been exacerbated by the way that ministerial education and formation funding has been distributed, which recently has led to dioceses being given a block grant by the Church of England based on the number and ages of ordinands it sponsors. The system has been reviewed lately by Synod. And whilst the money no longer goes exclusive to dioceses, the age weighting will still exist. So the grants are heavily weighted towards younger ordinands, aged 32 or younger. From the age of 40, the grant only covers the cost of part-time training. As you can see from the table, fewer than half of women ordinands train full-time, and fewer than 20% train residentially. Now, the implications of this are significant. Those who train our ordinands part-time are excellent, but there is no doubt you cannot cover the same amount of material in less time when someone is working full-time or indeed on placement for half the week. This raises the question of where our theologians are to come from in the future, because knowledge is another form of power. It is informative to note that currently only one of the principals of the theological education institutions, the TEIs, is a woman. That is Westcott in Cambridge. Interestingly, none of the institutions offering mixed mode or part-time training are led by women. And although there are women on the staff of TEIs, they are still very much in a minority. And we know from numerous research projects that change comes by example, by women seeing other women in the role, seeing cracks in the glass ceilings. Of course, there are lots of reasons why women tend to present for ordination later than men. Some to do with theology, coming through churches where their vocation is not encouraged or recognised, or just where they are not mentored because young men are more naturally encouraged, which links with the dearth of women leading larger churches. But it can also be linked to the very obvious question of the biological clock and the fear that somehow parenthood and priesthood are not compatible, which takes us back to the whole question of what we expect of our clergy, something which is becoming even more pressing with the financial crisis faced by so many of our dioceses. Back in 2018, a group of us took a raft of family-friendly policies through RACS, the Remuneration and Conditions of Service Committee, providing for all the dioceses a minimum of generosity, which all of them should adopt, thus providing security for women at whatever stage they may be in on their ordination journey. Sadly, because of financial constraints, not all dioceses have bought into this. Yet again, this is a question of who holds the purse strings and where resources are put. Money is power. The final area I want to just flag up now is that of bullying and harassment. I can't spend long on this, but it is vital that we at least acknowledge it. The issue of bullying and harassment is a fraught one in the church. If a clergy person is accused of this, then there is recourse to a CDM. But there is no proper recourse for a clergy person who is bullied or harassed by a member of the clergy. One of the things to note here is that whilst this may be a problem across genders and ethnicity, it is by far more prevalent with female clergy, even more so if they're UKME or GMH. Let me give you just one example. One diocese asked their curates in IME 4-7 to keep a journal for theological reflection. In 1 year, whilst every woman in the cohort recorded at least one situation of bullying and harassment, only one man did. And that is not unusual. One of the issues consistently recorded, and this is necessarily anecdotal, is that those who experience this are regularly advised to move on from their post, leaving the problem for the next person to deal with. Very few dioceses have structures in place to address this problem. Whereas they all now have safeguarding officers, indeed safeguarding teams, they do not have harassment advisors or officers, though these are standard in, for example, higher education contexts. And yet, a significant number of clergy, especially clergy women, are subject to malicious complaints and abuse. Of course, much of what, given time constraints, much of what I've spoken about today concerns clergy women. That doesn't mean that this doesn't also apply to the laity, but perhaps that's for a matter of discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you so much for that. We will take just a 2-minute break before we go into Q&A. So just 2 minutes to stretch your legs or whatever, and then we'll go into our question and answer session. Okay, we'll make a start. Thank you again, Karen and Liz, so much for your presentations. Karen, do you have any questions for Liz?
I just wondered, Liz, if we could talk a bit about the power of advocacy. You know, there is something about the power in your own statistics that someone has kind of already commented on, and there is something, isn't there, about how we monitor these things, but also how we advocate for others.
Yeah, that's really, really important, isn't it? I think, as you say, the statistics are great, and they're very powerful. And the key thing is bringing those into the open. One of the things that I have found really we've been able to do, or I've been able to do at various points, has been to bring those statistics into the open. And so I've shared them with the House and College of Bishops at various points. And that's been the key thing that's actually made things change. So, for example, with the Young Vocations piece, enabling the bishops to hear those statistics and say, what are we going to do about it? And that shifted, it changed the narrative, because we brought that into the open and said, look at this. And they went, oh, goodness me, you know, and that began to change the narrative. And I think it's really interesting. You can say anecdotally ... and people go, oh yeah, well, you know, how do you really know? But when you've got the statistics, it makes all the difference. And one of the things we did as a transformations group was we said, okay, we've got to get the stats behind us. We've got to know exactly what it is. And then once you've got them, then you can actually make all that difference. And being willing to speak out, being willing to put your head above the parapet and do that makes a huge difference.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we both, we didn't know what each of us were going to say or what the slides were, but we both had a slide of Bishop Sarah. Yes. And there is something, isn't there, about role models and and asking the question, you know, about visibility in terms of, because I feel a bit in our diocese, you know, so a number of women in roles have been replaced by men in roles, and so therefore there is a question of, as you know, how are women being visible, and the important, powerful symbol of Sarah in that, and particularly in London, but also in the national church.
Yeah, I think visibility is really, really important, and being willing to, it's really easy. I think one of the things that I notice is that often women quite like just getting on with the job. And I don't blame them at all. And I like getting on with my job, but actually, and it is costly to be willing to be out there and be seen. But actually, if you are out there and seen, it makes a huge difference. It makes a massive difference. I think, you know, I really honour Sarah for the fact that she is doing what she does. I mean, obviously it's her calling, but that she does it. And I think it does make a massive difference when women are willing to take on those jobs and are able to, and also speak out. You know, if they're in synod, they stand for synod, and all those things. It makes a massive difference. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Definitely.
Liz, I wonder if you've got any question for Karen.
Yeah, one of the things that really interested me in what you said, Karen, was, first of all, when you had those lists of different ways of power, and authority was in the top layer, and then we ended up with, and I was sitting thinking, oh, that's really interesting. I would have said authority was a key thing that women need to embrace and shouldn't be afraid of. And I thought the ones at the bottom were quite soft. So, you know, and then at the end, of course, we came back to authority, and it being the authority that comes from Christ. And I guess my question for you was, how do we as women make sure that we're not scared to step into authority? I remember being part of a conversation with someone who said, how do we describe women? You know, we can't use the word gravitas because women don't really have gravitas. Anyway, I know exactly that's my view too. So how do we as women embody authority? Because actually, if we're going to get, you know, we need to have it, don't we? What does that look like?
Yeah, because I think we bulk against it, don't we? We kind of think that we you know, the authority figure and all of that kind of thing. But I think there is something, isn't there, knowing the authority we have within us. Yes. And I think that comes from some of the types of power that I was describing, that actually, you know, if God has given us gifts or God has given us kind of resources, there is something there about knowing that. Let's boldly kind of step into that. And I think there is something about stepping into the role. We've talked a bit about this on Leading Women, about finding our voice, and you know, knowing where God has put us as well. You know, there is something about you know, the promptings of the Holy Spirit to kind of, you know, take the risk and to go on synod, or to you know, to take a position on a committee or something of which you know, you're going to have a bit more of a voice and a kind of a hook to change things for the better, I think. And I think, going back to my question about advocacy, I think it's just so key, because I think we don't just do it for ourselves, we do it together in all of that very often.
I wonder if very, very briefly, literally sort of a sentence or two sentences each, you might like to say something about something forward-looking. What are you hoping for at this point as you look at the situation in the Church of England? Karen first.
I think that a woman's voice brings transformation. There is still the sense of, you know, the male club has opened its doors to allow women to come in, but for me, it's how can then the church be different for Christ's sake, because we're there.
Thank you. And Liz?
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would also say that, just building on what I've just said, that there will be much more of that collaborative modelling across the church, in every part of the church, and it would be that mutuality that God originally called us to.
Thank you. Well, thank you. We've run out of time. I want to say a huge thank you to Karen and to Liz for their fantastic contributions and responding so well to all those questions. Thank you to everyone who asked questions and made comments in the chat, and sorry for those that we didn't have time to get to. And thanks to Rachel and to Theresa for doing our BSL interpretation, and particularly Theresa coping with internet problems, which I imagine have been really stressful for you. Thank you, nevertheless, for persisting, and Rachel for stepping in. So thank you, everyone, for all of that. I will just very briefly say we will soon be releasing the programme for the remainder of the year. We're not quite there yet, but we will be having sessions on neurodiversity and power in the church, on anarchism and power in the church, on the spirit and power in the church, and on bishops and power in the church over the coming year. So we'll be advertising all of those soon. Thank you all very much. And if you'd like to unmute, and we can give Karen and Liz a round of applause for their contributions.